There has been a war that has been waging now into its fourth full year that has been unbelievably deadly and costly. And that, of course, is the war between Ukraine and Russia, which the United States and its NATO allies have largely been funding and financing, funding the Ukrainian side. Hundreds of billions of dollars have gone to Kiev. Very little accounting for where it's actually going. Tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of young men and increasingly older men who are being recruited on each side are dead. And there's been no success from Ukraine in a long time. The front line moves very slowly, but it moves westward so that the Russian buffer is increasing, and the part of the country that Ukraine or that Kiev controls is decreasing. Russia now occupies roughly 23% of Ukrainian soil, if you count Crimea as well. It's turning into a rump state, as a lot of people predicted. It's an absolutely bloody, senseless war that could have and should have been diplomatically resolved near the beginning. But British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Ukraine fanatic Victoria Nuland, who was working in the Biden State Department running Ukraine, intervened and prevented any diplomatic solution because they wanted this war to continue, thinking they were being very clever and would weaken Russia by doing so. They didn't care about how many Ukrainians they killed or how much destruction they wrought in Ukraine, and how it has been very significant. From almost the first moment that he was inaugurated, Trump began devoting, obviously, concerted efforts to fulfilling his campaign pledge to bring an end to the war in Ukraine using diplomacy, something that Joe Biden refused to do, something that Kamala Harris essentially vowed she would never do. Their platform was, we're going to fund this war until the end, that when Ukraine wins. And one of the things that happened after that very melodramatic clash between President Zelensky of Ukraine on the one hand and Trump and his vice president, J.D. Vance, on the other in the Oval Office, was that Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire, and essentially this was a tactic to try and force Russia to agree to a ceasefire with none of the conditions that Russia really wanted. And at the time, as we showed you, there was a cliche that EU and NATO and even pro-Ukraine officials in the United States were using to try and put pressure on Russia. Here from Kaja Kallas, the former prime minister of Estonia. She's now the unelected foreign affairs minister of the EU. And this is what she said on March 11, 2025. I welcome the U.S.-Ukraine talks in Jeddah, notably regarding a ceasefire and resumption of U.S. intelligence and security assistance to Ukraine, but also in the humanitarian field. The ball, as always, is in Russia's court. Marco Rubio said the same thing. Today was a good day for peace, thanks to POTUS's leadership and under the gracious hospitality of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We are one step closer to restoring durable peace for Ukraine. The ball is now in Russia's court. And we showed you how that was essentially the script that everybody was using. Oh, look, Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire. Now it's up to Russia. Russia was never going to accept a ceasefire without the preconditions and the security guarantees they need and want, especially because they're winning the war. Trump clearly knew that. They scheduled a call, President Trump and President Putin did, for today. And afterwards, Donald Trump went to Truth Social to announce this about the call. Quote, my conversation today with President Putin of Russia was a very good and productive one. We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine. This war would never have started if I were president. Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact that thousands of soldiers are being killed, and both President Putin and President Zelensky would like to see it end. That process is now in full force and effect, and we will, hopefully, for the sake of humanity, get the job done. One of the things that has happened over the last week on the battlefield, which of course is unfavorable to Ukraine, as most events on the battlefield are, is that portion of Russia that the Ukrainians decided to occupy, diverting soldiers that were desperately needed on their own front line in the Kursk region, has basically shrunk to nothing. The Russians have essentially driven them out of that area that they had been occupying in a small area of Russia that Zelensky was hoping to use in order to negotiate, we'll give you back this land and then you have to give us back that. But there is no more land, basically, that Ukraine is occupying. Trump himself said last week that when he talked to the Russians, he wants to convince them, essentially allow the Ukrainians to surrender. He said they are surrounded by Russian troops and they're all going to get slaughtered. As it turns out, there were Western intelligence agents, unsurprisingly, among them. And so this war is just going very terribly for Ukraine and has been for quite some time. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, posted this readout of President Donald J. Trump's call with President Vladimir Putin. Quote, today, President Trump and President Putin spoke about the need for peace and a ceasefire in the Ukraine war. Both leaders agreed this conflict needs to end with a lasting peace. They also stressed the need for improved bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. The blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending in this war would be better spent on the needs of their people. This conflict should never have started and should have ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire, and permanent peace. Then these negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. The leaders spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts. They further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons and will engage with others to ensure the broadest application possible. The two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. Oh, thank God that Trump brought up Israel in his conversation with President Putin. I wouldn't want that ever to be omitted, the most important priority there is. It went on, quote, the two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upside. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. So there's a lot of components to this. First of all, a temporary ceasefire, partial ceasefire, where each side agrees to stop bombing each other's energy infrastructure would already go a long way to eliminating some of the worst parts of this war. The Russians have often wiped out major parts of the Ukrainian energy sector, including the parts that allow them to provide heat to their citizens in what is a very cold winter, and they've had to go without heat for a long time. But the Ukrainians have also done damage to Russian oil infrastructure. Once Biden allowed long-range missiles to be used to strike inside Russia, they've typically used that to strike oil infrastructure and other energy assets of the Russians that have caused damage to an economy that is somewhat strained as a result of this war. So each side would have great value in that. But I think the much more important component is that once an agreement to end this war is facilitated, Trump wants and has long wanted better relations with Moscow, an end to this insane animosity and antagonism that has been imposed at least as early as 2016 as a result of Russiagate, where this climate was created that U.S. officials couldn't even talk to Russian officials without being suspected of disloyalty and even treason, an incredibly dangerous climate to impose between the two largest nuclear powers on the planet. And it's not just that you then lower the tension and begin speaking, but the U.S. and Russia have long had common interests that they can work on together. That's something that President Obama often stressed. In fact, he partnered with the Russians in getting the Iran deal done because Russia is far more trusted by Iran than anyone in the West. And President Trump actually proposed a partnership with the Russians to select terrorism targets in Syria. Obama did the same because the Russians have the same sort of animosity toward Islamic radicals who use terrorism and other types of violence, because they've been attacked by that many times as well. That's something they've always had in common, the two sides. So a improved set of relations between Russia and the United States is always in the interest of the world. And if Trump manages to do that, not just to end the war, but to do that, and even if he just manages to end the war, he will deserve massive credit because this war has been repulsive in the way that wars typically are. The U.S. State Department issued its own release, joint statement on the United States-Ukraine meeting in Jeddah. Actually, this was from last week when the United States met with Zelensky, met with Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia. Quote, Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the U.S. proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation. Now, the Russians did not agree to that deal because they obviously want conditions that are necessary in their view to preserve their security, that Ukraine will never be part of NATO, that Ukraine will be a neutral buffer zone, aspects relating to the placement of weapons, Ukrainian weapons or Western weapons inside Ukraine, not near the Russian border. That is something going to be that Russia is going to negotiate and demand because they've spent a huge amount of resources on this war. They've lost a lot of their citizens' lives. They spent a massive amount of money remilitarizing and getting on war footing. And as we discussed when I interviewed Professor Dugin in Moscow and interviewed other people in Moscow as well, there are a lot of factions inside Moscow, power centers inside Russia, that won't accept any old peace deal that just ends the war. They're going to want benefits to Russia for having won the war, for having sacrificed so many of their people, and the families of those people and Russians in general are going to expect that as well. So it won't be easy to facilitate a peace deal, but the fact that Trump is already getting the Russians to agree to a temporary partial ceasefire, one that the Ukrainians are saying that they're likely to accept, is something that is very valuable. Here is a news story. Mexico extradites 29 drug traffickers to the U.S. to avoid trade tariffs. We all know how deceptive corporate media can be. They push agendas, censor voices, and make sure you only see one side of the story. That's exactly why I started this show, because I believe in free speech and real conversations and unconstrained reporting that pursues the best version of the truth the journalist is capable of. And I partnered with a website with an app that believes in that too. That's Ground News, which prioritizes free speech over controlling the narrative. For every story, you can find all the articles reporting on it worldwide with context. Like if a news source has any political bias, how credible they are, and if any major corporation is influencing the reporting. All I have to do is swipe through coverage with tags indicating if it's coming from liberal or conservative sources, from corporate or independent voices, and from there decide for myself if Mexico's unprecedented extradition of 29 cartel members to the U.S. is proof that Trump's tariff tactics work, like some conservative sources report, or if it's just a routine legal process and one of the cartel members pled not guilty anyway, as the center and the left are claiming. Different sources say different things. If I had just read one of those sources, I'd have a completely skewed version of reality. But with Ground News, I and you could put them side by side and decide for myself who's actually telling the truth. Ground News even created a dedicated feed called Blind Spot that exposes stories that either side of the political spectrum is reporting on, making it possible to spot stories the people in charge don't want you to see. Ground News is bringing back transparency in the news and civil discourse right from your phone or computer. Best of all, they're independent and subscriber supported, and they're offering my viewers 40% off the same Vantage plan I use to get unlimited access to all the features this month. So just scan the QR code to check them out. That's ground.news/GG. You can go there too for 40% off. If you like this show, I'm quite convinced you will love this platform. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.